Let us join our hearts together in prayer. Holy One, we seek your guidance, that from the written word and the spoken word, we can hear your true and everlasting word. Alleluia and amen. In the early morning hours of last Sunday, a gunman entered the Pulse Bar in Orlando. Omar Martin entered with a semi-automatic weapon and shot 49 people, killing them and wounded even more before dying in a shootout with police. It was the greatest loss of life in modern American history from a mass shooting. To find a worse incident, we have to go back 100 years to the Tulsa race riot, a time in our country's history where a mob of white people killed over 300 African Americans. But of course, we don't have to remember back far to think of other tragic mass shootings. An office in San Bernardino, an abortion clinic in Colorado, a college in Oregon, Mother Emanuel Church in South Carolina, the Sikh Temple here in Wisconsin. The heartbreak of this act of terrorism comes home to me in the photos of victims, and especially in the horrifying exchange of texts between a mother and her son trapped in a bathroom with Martine. It's awful to read those texts of that trapped man. Please send someone to help us, and to think of the terrifying anguish and desperation of his mother. When I learned of the shooting in worship, when Sachin mentioned it to me after reading the scriptures, I thought it must be the act of a white supremacist or a Christian conservative. Because you see, we've come to expect that kind of violence against the LGBT community from those groups. Indeed, the Southern Poverty Law Center, which tracks hate groups, has recorded an increase in hate crimes against the LGBT community over the last 10 years. Mark Potok of the center reports that LGBT people are twice as likely as Jews and blacks to be victims of hate crimes. This last shooting brought me back to Mother Emanuel Church, which suffered the violent death of 9 people in a Bible study at the hands of a white supremacist. In many ways, gay bars play the same role in the LGBT community as churches do in the African American community. In each community, whether it was a bar or church, these were the first institutions that our communities could build and have as their own. It was in these communities that provided a place of sanctuary where one could be gay or black without the bigotry faced in the outside world. Even as the social lives of gays and blacks changed, bars like Pulse and churches like Mother Emanuel remained central to their communities, all of which made the murders in these places feel like a sacrilege. Details quickly emerged about the Orlando shooter, which surprised me. He claimed to act in the name of ISIS, but also the Al-Qaeda-inspired Boston Marathon bombers and the Al-Nusra Front. And it didn't seem to bother him that these 3 groups didn't get along. And then came the news of his violent and abusive relationship with his ex-wife and his homophobia, according to his father. Even more confusing, the detail that he apparently used gay dating apps and was a patron at a gay bar. It was all the more bizarre, that last detail. The idea that Martine was a man deeply conflicted with his own sexuality, longing for and hating other men. In the immediate aftermath of this tragedy, conversation quickly turned to familiar positions. On the political right, it seemed as if everyone wanted to talk about anything other than guns. And so attention focused on Martine as a Muslim, with calls to ban Muslim immigration and warnings about radical Islamism. But when the shooter in such events is a white man, the discuss anything but guns approach focuses on mental health. Underneath the rhetoric, I hear one plea: don't notice the guns. Of course, in the political left, the massacre became another clarion call to address the ubiquity of guns on our streets. At City Hall in Milwaukee, the bell tolled not for the 49 victims of this shooting, but for the 16 mass shootings that have happened during President Obama's term in office. I'm for gun control. I agree with comedian Trevor Noah, who pointed out that after 9/11, when 4 planes killed over 3,000 Americans, we enacted tougher controls on flying instead of hiding behind the slogan, "Planes don't kill people, people kill people." I hope we make meaningful progress on gun control. But even while I agree with the logic of gun control, I struggle when I hear the same rhetorical positions on the right and the left that people have believed before this tragedy. I struggle because it feels like these 49 deaths, these 49 victims, didn't change our thinking at all. we're still locked in the same positions, peering out behind the political bunkers we've long ago dug for ourselves. This week, I long to understand this tragedy beyond the familiar analysis I've come to hear after these kinds of events. I kept thinking back to Mother Emanuel in the Sikh temple. I wanted to see the connection between the actions of white supremacists and someone claiming the mantle of radical Islamism. What did Dylan Roof and Wade Michael Page and Omar Mateen have in common besides the use of guns? What links these men? What links these men together besides their hatred of the other? Why these men? Well, wondering about the connection between these men who killed in Charleston, in Milwaukee, in Orlando, I came across an essay by James Hamlin, who pointed out that 98% of mass shootings are done by men. This led Hamlin to suggest we face a crisis of toxic masculinity. By toxic masculinity, he meant a view of being a man rooted in dominance, one in which self-loathing becomes directed outward in controlling other people, where manhood must be proven and emasculation remains a constant threat. What Mateen encountered at Pulse was anything but toxic masculinity. Drag queens were only the beginning of the playful range of masculinity at Pulse. The spiritual journey of coming out as gay involves far more than just accepting what gives sexual pleasure. The real work of coming out means being comfortable in your own skin, not just loving people of your own gender, but loving your own particular way of expressing your gender. You hear this in the profiles of the 49 people killed in Orlando. People like Stanley Almovidar, who a friend explained, he made me feel like it was perfectly fine being who I was. And Lewis Wilson Leon, described by a friend as a wonderful man full of life, who endured countless days of bullying while growing up by cruel people calling him all sorts of horrendous homophobic slurs. He was the first person on this earth I came out to, and he always protected and loved his friends. His strength and character was always an inspiration to all of us. Or Xavier Rosado, who, as a friend said, lived in his truth. I think that's, to me, these speak to what it means to come out as an LGBT person, to get comfortable in living in your own truth. And I think that's also what was happening at Mother Emanuel. Because an institution like Mother Emanuel is a place where black people are coming and claiming and living proudly in their own skin. These kinds of places were deeply threatening to Mateen. The men and women killed at Pulse, LGBT and allies alike, were developing their own versions of what it meant to be a man or a woman, rooted in their own skin instead of toxic ideas of domination and control. And I think this comfortability in their own skin is what so disturbed Mateen. Seeing Mateen as an expression of toxic masculinity caused me to look at other issues in a new light. In the week before Orlando, much of the talk in our country centered around the Stanford college student who raped an unconscious woman. His father tried to defend his son by writing it off as 20 minutes of action. But no, this violence against an unconscious person was not about action, but domination. Not about sexual pleasure, but control. Not about a hookup culture on campus, but a twisted concept of being a man. Toxic masculinity. And likewise, this concept of toxic masculinity caused me to see the recent legislative attacks on LGBT people in a new way. Why all this concern about bathrooms in North Carolina? Why all this effort to segregate LGBT people in Mississippi? Why all this transgender panic in straight houses across the country? I think it's all about a deep-seated anxiety about gender, an attempt by some men to assert dominance and control over how gender gets expressed. Toxic masculinity. And it's not just violence against LGBT people and women. Behind last year's violence in Charleston and other mass murderers lies a dangerous misconception about what it means to be a man, as if violence over someone else makes you a man. Of course, toxic masculinity isn't new. Over the last month, we've read from the book 1 Kings, and as it presents the story of Elijah. I struggle with the story of Elijah because this celebrated prophet killed those who disagreed with him. Massacre shaped his story, including the passage we read today. Elijah ran out into the desert because he was afraid King Ahab and Queen Jezebel would arrest him and kill him for the murders he committed. In many ways, this scene plays out like an ancient version of the story of Eric Rudolph. Rudolph, as you might remember, was the man who bombed the Atlanta Olympics, killing 2 and wounding over 100. And after he committed that bombing, he went on to bomb a lesbian bar and 2 abortion clinics, and then he fled to the mountains of North Carolina. We don't know what Rudolph thought during his hiding, but we do get a description of Elijah. Now, normally we read this story with a focus on Elijah hearing the still small voice of God. We use it as a story about the subtle ways God speaks to us. And while I believe that to be true, I'm asking different questions today. Elijah's fear stands out in this story. It's not just that he was afraid of Ahab and Jezebel's revenge. It's that he was afraid because he didn't know what to do when that equation he'd worked out about dominance making him feel good as a man, when that didn't hold true. Because he didn't find satisfaction that he thought he would find. Instead, he found himself afraid and empty and alone. The failure of his violence to bring him peace left him ready to die. "It's enough," he said to God. "Take away my life, for I am no better than my ancestors." Even when God cared for him, even when God appears to him, Elijah felt overwhelmed by his loneliness. Elijah said, "I alone am left." And even when God said to him, "There are 7,000 other people just like you in Israel," he said, "I alone am left." God gave Elijah work to do. And yet in the following chapters, we watch as Elijah fails at nearly every assignment. At the very end of the story, it said he doesn't die but ascends to heaven. It's as if he can't even complete his human journey, but remains the loner, the wanderer, the ghost of a man who couldn't even anoint a successor but instead just throws him some used clothing. The authors of the Bible didn't mean me to read it this way, but I hear in this story the poisonous effects of toxic masculinity. Domination was meant to make him feel like a man, but instead Elijah experienced a desperate emptiness. He thought the violence would make him great, but instead it left him alone, a ghost of a man. This Father's Day, in the wake of Orlando, I think we need to imagine new ways of being a man. For each of us, male or female, to talk about the kinds of masculinity we see in our sons, brothers, lovers, friends. To cultivate healthy models of masculinity, to celebrate the people who demonstrate true manhood. Framing the problem as toxic masculinity allows us to connect what happened in Orlando to what happened at Mother Emanuel. One shooter claimed radical Islamism, the other white supremacy, but both demonstrated a broken concept of manhood. And therefore, I think it provides a bridge of solidarity between people of different faiths and races as we work on a common problem. Because you see, to dismiss Mateen as just simply someone embracing radical Islamism misses the way in which toxic masculinity is a problem in many cultures. It misses the way in which toxic masculinity is a problem we see in white people who are committing acts of white supremacy. It misses the way in which we saw it just the other day in England as a man went after and killed on the street an English politician. This is a problem that's not just in radical Islamism, it's not just in white supremacy, it's a problem of toxic masculinity. Decades ago, Tony Kushner wrote Angels in America as a fantasy exploration of gay life, AIDS, and American politics in the 1980s. You know, the AIDS crisis was right in the forefront of that play. It was right center stage. But the real issue, the real crisis, I think, in that play was the regime of old prejudices and bigotries and privileges. At the end of the play, the main character, Pryor, gave a benediction over the audience, saying, "The world only spins forward. We will be citizens. The time has come. Bye now. You are fabulous creatures, each and every one. And I bless you. More life. The great work begins. After Orlando, the great work begins. Reimagining gender and embracing the diversity of its expression, celebrating healthy masculinity, vibrant femininity, and, like the patrons of Pulse, living into our truth. Alleluia and amen.